100 Forgotten Things from 1950s New York. A nostalgic journey through a city that never really slept, just blinked slower in black and white. You didn't just walk through Times Square. In the 1950s, you drifted. Neon buzzed like electricity in your veins. The smell of roasted peanuts and exhaust clung to your coat. Headlines barked from corner boys. Sinatra poured out of record shops. And even though the sidewalks were crowded, you felt like the only one with a secret. The automat wasn't fast food. It was ritual. You'd line up behind businessmen and secretaries, eyeing rows of glass compartments like they were treasure chests. Slip in a nickel twist the knob, and a steaming pot pie or a slice of cherry pie would click open like magic. Coffee came from a chrome spout that hissed and never ran out, and somehow it always tasted like Saturday. Your mother bought fish wrapped in newspaper from the Fulton Fish Market. The air reeked of salt brine and early morning. Dock workers smoked unfiltered cigarettes and shouted prices over crates of ice. You never liked the smell, but you liked watching her haggle one eyebrow, raised exact change ready. Back then, Central Park had horses. Carriages clattered down tree-lined paths, and kids fed pigeons from wax paper bags. On summer evenings, families brought radios, picnics, and patience. Fireflies blinked near the ramble. Someone always had a harmonica. And for a moment, the city softened. Brooklyn stoops were more than steps. They were stages. Kids played jack stickball or just hollered each other's names until moms leaned out windows and said, "Enough already." Chalk drawings faded with the rain. Secrets were whispered under fire escapes. And sometimes a first kiss happened right there between brick and sky. Elevators in department stores had uniformed operators who spoke like radio hosts. Fourth floor women's shoes, hats, gloves, and accessories. The gates folded shut with a clack. The ride was smooth, and you felt like you were traveling to another world. And maybe you were. Coney Island wasn't just a beach. It was a kingdom. The cyclone rattled your bones. The boardwalk smelled of cotton candy salt and sunburn. You didn't ask where the hot dogs came from at Nathan's. You just stood in line with wet hair and sandy toes knowing they'd taste perfect. The IRT subway lines screeched like metal beasts, and token booths felt like confessionals. You handed over a dime, ducked through the turnstile, and hoped the train came before your thoughts caught up to you. The seats were hard, the graffiti was minimal, and the air was warm from below, not above. At Yankee Stadium, it didn't matter where you sat. Bleachers box or behind a pillar, the crack of Mickey Mantle's bat echoed the same. Vendors yelled, "Getcha peanuts," and kids counted innings like birthdays. The grass was impossibly green, and for those 9 innings, New York belonged to the Bronx. Pushcarts lined Orchard Street and the Lower East Side. You could buy pickles from a barrel, a wool cap, or a second-hand radio that maybe worked. The air was thick with accents: Yiddish, Italian, Irish, Spanish. Each block was its own world. And if you knew how to haggle, you were already halfway home. The skyline wasn't crowded yet. You could stand on a rooftop in Queens, look west, and count the buildings. Empire State, Chrysler, Rockefeller. They didn't just pierce the sky, they defined it. And at dusk, when the city lit up like a million fireflies, you felt small in the best way. In the Bronx, stoop ball wasn't just a game, it was how you proved yourself. You'd spend hours slinging a pink rubber Spalding ball against cracked steps, dodging cars and older kids. The rules changed by the block, but the pride never did. And if you hit the sweet spot just above the fourth stair, you were a legend until dinner. Old men in flat caps played dominoes in Washington Square. The click of tiles echoed beneath the elms while saxophones wept on distant corners. You could sit beside them, quiet, unnoticed, and still learn everything you needed to know about rhythm, respect, and when to keep your mouth shut. Saturday mornings meant chores or pretending to do them. Moms scrubbed stoops, hung sheets on pulley clotheslines that sagged between tenements like tired kites. Radios played the Andrews Sisters or early doo-wop. The scent of starch and bleach floated out with the laundry, mingling with the aroma of someone's onion bagels warming down the hall. Barbershops were sanctuaries. You perched on cracked vinyl chairs while your father swapped jokes with the barber. The red and white pole spun like a promise. Clippers buzzed, scissors clicked, and magazines on the table told stories you weren't quite old enough to understand. But you listened anyway. In Harlem church on Sunday was a parade of hats and hymns. Choirs filled the air with soul, and the sermons felt like thunder and honey. Afterwards, streets came alive with laughter, fried fish, and arguments about Jackie Robinson. Kids chased each other between stoops, while elders leaned on canes, smiling at the future running past. You bought pretzels from pushcarts, warm, salty, wrapped in waxed paper, and handed over with barely a word. The vendor barely looked up, but somehow always remembered you liked yours extra salty. He nodded like you shared a secret. The Statue of Liberty didn't need a ticket to matter. You just had to glimpse her from the Staten Island ferry sea spray in your face coat flapping, and for a second, just a second, you believed in every promise your grandfather once whispered in broken English. Newsboys still shouted, "Extra, extra." Read all about it. Their fingers blackened with ink, their voices hoarse with repetition. You didn't always buy, but you always looked. Sometimes the story was war. Sometimes it was a movie star. Either way, the city buzzed a little louder for a headline. Ice delivery wasn't fully gone yet. A blocky man with tattooed forearms would lug a dripping cube into a deli's back door, water pooling at his boots. You watched from the curb, fascinated, as if seeing winter hauled in by hand, one glistening slab at a time. At the cloisters, it always felt like you stepped into another century. Quiet stone arches, stained glass glowing like melted jewels, and the scent of ancient wood. School trips here weren't loud. They were reverent. Even the rowdiest kid hushed when the guide whispered about unicorn tapestries. The corner candy store wasn't just for sweets. It was where you bought comic books, baseball cards, and a grape soda cold from the icebox. You'd press your forehead to the glass, debating between licorice laces or wax bottles filled with juice. The old man behind the counter never rushed you. He knew choosing took time. Kids still roller skated on cracked sidewalks, the kind with key-tightened skates strapped over sneakers. You fell a lot. Knees scraped, palms burned, pride bruised. But when you finally cruised 3 full blocks without stumbling, arms out like wings, you felt invincible. Grand Central wasn't just a station, it was a cathedral of motion. You'd tilt your head back, staring at that vaulted ceiling of stars, painted green and gold. Trains hissed and clanged below. Briefcases clicked, and lovers kissed goodbye under the clock. You didn't have to go anywhere to feel like you were already part of something moving. In Queens, the backyards were barely big enough for a garden, but someone always had tomatoes growing in coffee cans. Lined up along the fence like soldiers, they leaned toward the sun between laundry days. The kids played under the clotheslines, ducking the wet sheets like ghosts chasing each other on a dare. Prospect Park had its own rhythm. You'd walk past drummers beating buckets, couples rowing boats, kids dangling from the monkey bars, all under trees older than your grandmother. The smell of hot chestnuts in paper cones and the distant crack of a stickball bat said it was Saturday. You didn't need money, just time. The rooftops were worlds of their own. People hung laundry, fixed antennas, or just sat on folding chairs watching the city breathe. You could see all 5 boroughs from up there if you squinted hard enough. And at night, under the buzz of a bare bulb, someone always had a radio playing Sinatra soft enough that nobody complained. At Woolworth's, the lunch counter was chrome and clatter. You slid onto a stool, ordered a grilled cheese and a vanilla malt, and watched the server spin in her saddle shoes like she was born behind the counter. The prices were scrawled on little boards overhead, and even then, it felt like a bargain. The shoeshine men worked fast elbows, pumping brushes flying. They sat on tiny stools at the edge of Penn Station, or outside the New Yorker hotel humming jazz, while the city passed by in scuffed leather. They didn't talk much, but they made your shoes look like Sunday, even if it was only Thursday. The public libraries smelled like dust and wisdom. Inside, it was always a little too quiet, the kind of hush that made you straighten your back. Card catalogs clicked. Pages turned slowly. A librarian with horn-rimmed glasses watched from behind the desk like a sentry guarding the kingdom of stories. The ice cream truck still rang its bells down side streets. Kids would scramble with quarters clutched tight barefoot on hot pavement chanting, "Wait, wait." The music was tinny, cheerful, slightly off-key, but to your ears, it was a fanfare announcing summer had truly arrived. Evening movies in neighborhood parks meant folding chairs, mosquito spray, and hands dipped into shared popcorn bags. The screen fluttered in the wind. Sometimes the reel broke. Sometimes it rained. But nobody left unless the projector did. Parents whispered. Kids giggled, and the stars above blinked along. The garment district was all motion scissors, steam chalk lines, and chatter in at least 5 languages. Seamstresses pinned hems like surgeons. Tailors marked wool with flicks of white dust. Bolts of fabric leaned like dominoes against narrow walls. Everyone was always late. Everyone knew your measurements better than your name. Streetcars still clattered through certain parts of Brooklyn before they disappeared for good. The overhead wires buzzed like bees. You'd hop on with a nickel squeeze past someone's shopping bag and find a seat that felt like it had 100 stories baked into its cushion. When it turned the corner too fast, everyone swayed in rhythm. On Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, the baker knew your name and your grandmother's order. Semolina loaves stacked behind foggy glass biscotti, wrapped in twine, and the smell yeasty warm, like someone had just opened a memory. You waited your turn, hands sticky with flour dust from the free cookie. He slipped you when your mother wasn't looking. Hanukkah in Williamsburg meant glowing windows and spinning dreidels on tiled floors. You'd walk past rows of brownstones, lit softly with menorahs, each candle flickering against the cold night glass. Inside, the scent of oil and onions drifted out with every open door. Kids giggled over chocolate gelt. The prayers were old, but the joy was always fresh. Greek diners served everything: fried eggs, lamb souvlaki chocolate milkshakes, and life advice from a man with thick eyebrows and a voice like gravel. The booths were cracked, the menus laminated, and if you came in twice, you were family. You didn't ask for change back. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just refilled your cup and nodded. Snow days in Washington Heights began with silence. Then came the scraping metal shovels, boots against stairs, laughter tumbling down from fire escapes. Kids built lopsided forts and dared each other to climb fences thick with icicles. The avenue sparkled salted and soft. And for a few hours, New York belonged to children and steam. The corner shoemaker worked in shadows, bent over a wooden bench, hammer, tapping eyes squinting through cigar smoke. You brought your scuffed loafers or your father's work boots, and a week later, they came back stronger. He barely spoke, just handed them over with a nod, a quiet contract sealed in leather and glue. The radio was never background noise. It was the room. The voices of the Lone Ranger, the Shadow, or Jack Benny filled living rooms like guests at the table. Families gathered around glowing dials, adjusting rabbit ears, clapping when the signal came through. Nobody looked at their hands. Everyone listened. Elevated trains above 3rd Avenue roared like giants. You'd walk under them and feel the whole sidewalk shake. Rain dripped from steel supports. Conversations paused when one passed. They were loud, greasy, ugly, and loved. When they were torn down, it was like losing a part of the city's voice. Public school classrooms had wooden desks carved with initials, blackboards that still smelled of chalk, and radiators that hissed louder than the teachers. You memorized the Pledge of Allegiance long division and which kids to avoid at recess. When it snowed, you prayed for the radio to say your school number. The old cathedral bells in St. Patrick's rang low and solemn, echoing off buildings like prayers too big for whispers. On Sunday mornings, the streets nearby were hushed, even the taxis slowed. You'd stop and listen, even if you didn't know why. There were theaters where the matinee ticket got you a double feature, a cartoon, and a newsreel. Velvet seats creaked. The usher wore gloves. And if you were lucky, you found a nickel under the seat cushion. Kids clapped when the lights dimmed. Adults whispered during the credits. Nobody checked their watch. Harlem barbershops had rhythm clippers buzzing gospel playing low stories traded like currency. You waited your turn not just for a haircut, but for the talk. Boxes ball players, politics, and how your mama was doing. It wasn't just where you got shaped up, it's where you got brought up. In Pelham Bay Park, summer was spelled in sweat and sugar. The sun beat down on tennis courts and checkered picnic blankets. Radios blared doo-wop under elm trees. Ice cream melted faster than you could eat it. And somewhere near the playground, someone's uncle was always manning a smoking grill, flipping hot dogs with a bent fork and a beer in hand. Little Italy, during the San Gennaro festival, was more than just lights and cannoli. It was the old country, poured into Mulberry Street for one noisy, holy sweet-smelling week. Streamers fluttered above red, white, green like someone painted the sky. Priests walked in procession. Kids balanced Zeppeli grease and confetti in their hair. And the music never stopped. In Staten Island, moonlight was brighter than street lamps. The ferry chugged across dark water like a whisper lights bobbing in the harbor. Couples leaned against the rail, breath misting hands warm in one another's pockets. You could still hear Manhattan's pulse from out there, but it sounded like memory, not motion. Down at the piers, dock workers returned home in silence. Boots heavy, shoulders square, salt crusted in the creases of their coats. You'd see them coming through the fog just before supper, lunch pails swinging eyes low proud. Their shift never made the papers, but the city leaned on it just the same. The cobblers and tailors in Hell's Kitchen worked with hands like tools and hearts that missed countries you'd never seen. Pins in their mouths, threads between fingers, a radio tuned to stations that only came in after dark. You didn't understand the language, but you understood what it meant. Make it last. The corner soda fountain was where kids practiced charm. You asked for a cherry Coke, maybe slid a folded note across the counter to someone who looked like tomorrow. The stools spun, the jukebox blinked, and when your song came on, you sipped slow, like somehow the taste would last longer than the summer. The Sunday papers were an event, heavy as bricks, ink that stained your fingers, comics in color, ads for dresses you couldn't afford. You'd stretch out on the rug legs crossed the whole day spread before you in pages. Even the silence that came with reading felt warm. In Chinatown, lanterns danced between fire escapes, and the smell of roasted duck hung thick in the air. You'd press your face to a window, watch a butcher work a cleaver like a violinist, and feel like you were somewhere far away, even though the subway was still just a block behind you. The schoolyard after class was a kingdom. No teachers, no bells, just jump rope chants, scuffed knees, and packs made in chalk dust. Kids played until the streetlights blinked on. That was the signal. You didn't need a clock. You just needed the glow to know it was time to go. Uptown apartment buildings had brass mailboxes and doormen who knew your name, your secrets, and your shoe shine schedule. They stood like sentries, polite, firm, always with a tip of the hat. Kids ran past them, like they weren't even there, but every parent knew they were the reason you got home safe. The fish stores in Brighton Beach still had live tanks in the window. Silver scales flickered under fluorescent light. The floor was always wet. The air smelled like brine and cold. And the old woman behind the counter could gut a fish without ever looking down, all while arguing about yesterday's price. In Flushing, the corner drugstore wasn't just where you got cough syrup. It was where you sat on red vinyl stools and ordered a root beer float while the pharmacist counted pills behind frosted glass. There was a rack of birthday cards. No one ever bought a display of nylons in egg-shaped cases, and a bell that rang every time someone walked in like it had been waiting just for them. The photo studio on 108th Street smelled like flash powder and static. You stood in front of a curtain, back stiff, unsure where to look. The photographer barked, "Don't blink." And then the bulb popped white-hot like lightning. Weeks later, the proof arrived slightly blurry, too serious, but it was you, and it mattered. Up in Yonkers, the train platforms were always foggy in the morning. You could hear the whistle before you saw the lights. Commuters stood shoulder to shoulder, newspapers tucked under arm's breadth, clouding in the chill. The tracks hummed, and for a second, everyone stopped pretending not to be tired. Every fall, someone on your block hung a scarecrow in their tiny front yard. just a shirt stuffed with straw, a pumpkin head, and maybe a scarf from last winter. Kids added buttons for eyes. It wasn't fancy. But when the leaves turned and the wind picked up, it felt like even the city had a harvest season. The hallway radiators hissed like old snakes in winter. You'd press your hands to them until they were pink and warm, then run off to play. They clanged at night like they were dreaming of factory work. In a city of noise, they were the lullaby you never thought to thank. On the Upper West Side, brownstones wore ivy like jewelry. You'd pass them on the way to school and wonder who lived behind those big oak doors. On snowy mornings, footsteps stayed visible for hours. You'd follow them, pretending they led to something magical, even if they just ended at the corner bodega. Street musicians still played violins on stoops. Not for money, just because. The notes floated between buildings, landed in puddles, and clung to fire escapes like laundry on a windy day. You'd stop just for a second and feel like you were in a movie without knowing the plot. Every borough had a cousin with a rooftop garden. Tomato plants in buckets, mint growing wild near the vents, and folding chairs rusted from rain. They'd point to the skyline like it was theirs. See, that they'd say, that's the Empire State Building. And this is where we live. Grocery stores still had butchers who knew your father's name. They'd wrap the meat in brown paper and twine scribbles the total in pencil on the outside, and always throw in a bone for the dog. The floor was sawdust. The scale had a needle. The smell was a mixture of fat and trust. In Jackson Heights, stoops turned into movie theaters on hot nights. Someone rigged a white sheet between windows. Kids brought folding chairs. The reel flickered and sputtered, black and white shadows dancing against brick. When the projector jammed, no one complained. They just waited together. Some bus drivers wore ties. They tipped their caps. They said good morning. You didn't have to tell them your stop, they remembered. On rainy days, they'd wait the extra second so your grandmother could climb aboard. And even though the ride was bumpy, it always felt like you'd get exactly where you needed to go. In Queens, flea markets bloomed like wildflowers every weekend. Rows of card tables, crates of vinyl records, old costume jewelry tangled like vines. You could find a baseball mitt with someone else's initials, a typewriter missing the E, or a Polaroid camera that still worked sometimes. The sellers haggled in 3 languages. The buyers knew how to smile without agreeing just yet. At the barber shop, next to the movie house, the smell of bay rum aftershave and talcum powder hung heavy. Boys sat in chairs too big for them, fidgeting while their fathers read the daily news. The sound of scissors, the hum of a fan, the baritone chatter of grown men talking about the Dodgers, it all felt like Sunday, even on a Wednesday. There was a time when morning didn't begin with an alarm clock, but with the rattle of a delivery truck and the soft thud of the newspaper hitting the door. You'd lie there in bed, half asleep, and hear your father shuffle to the hallway to pick it up. The rustle of pages and the faint smell of newsprint told you the day had begun. On fire escapes, sparrows made tiny homes from threads and string. You'd sit near the window with your elbows on the sill, watching the city yawn awake, steam rising from vents. Bread trucks rumbling down side streets, someone already out walking a dog in slippers. The light came in golden. It always felt borrowed. Kids played handball against the schoolyard walls, no gloves, no scoreboard, just chalk lines and rhythm. You learned who played fair, who cheated, and who you'd have to beat if you ever wanted to be remembered past recess. The ball echoed like a heartbeat, sharp and steady. In the South Bronx, you could still buy snow cones from a guy with a cart who rang a bell that sounded like summer. He'd scrape the ice by hand, pile it into paper cones, and douse it with syrup, blue raspberry cherry, sometimes cola. Your fingers turned red. Your lips turned purple. You didn't care. Every subway station had a musician, sometimes a saxophone, sometimes a harmonica. Once, even a saw played with a violin bow. You didn't always stop, but when you did, the notes followed you up the stairs like ghosts. Some days, you didn't even drop a coin, just a glance, and that was enough. The bodegas weren't 24-hour yet, but they felt eternal. Fluorescent lights, buzzing overhead shelves, packed with canned beans, boxed soap, and baseball cards by the register. A bell above the door rang when you entered. The man behind the counter never wrote anything down, but he always knew exactly how much you owed and whether your mother wanted white rice or yellow this time. The rain in New York never asked permission. It came in sideways soaked. Your collar turned subway grates into geysers. Kids danced barefoot in gutters, floated bottle caps in puddles, and dared each other to run under awnings. Nobody carried umbrellas. You just learned how to dry off quick. At the back of old churches, candles flickered like promises. People lit them for things they couldn't say out loud. Safe travels, good test scores, second chances. The wax dripped slowly. The silence held like velvet. Even if you weren't religious, you understood that something important was happening there. On the Upper East Side, French bakeries felt like something out of a picture book. The bell above the door chimed like a whisper. The glass case shimmered with eclair Napoleons and buttery croissants wrapped in thin wax paper. You stood on tiptoe, breath fogging the glass while your mother chose carefully, not by price, but by mood. Riverside Park was a quieter kind of magic. Long benches beneath elm trees, couples strolling without talking, and the wind lifting leaves like stories not yet told. Jogging wasn't a thing yet. You walked for the sake of walking to clear your thoughts, or sometimes just to be alone with the city at its gentlest. Dinner time meant meatloaf peas and the voice of the 6 o'clock news. Your father folded his napkin the same way every night. Your mother watched the clock more than the food. You passed the salt like it mattered. The announcer's voice came through the radio calm and certain, even when the news wasn't. Milk bottles still clinked on stoops at dawn. Glass, not plastic. Cold with foil caps that crinkled when you peeled them back. You'd race your siblings to be the first to grab it, just to feel the chill on your fingers and the pride of delivering it to the kitchen like treasure. The corner mailbox was royal blue and heavy. You'd lift the handle with both hands and drop your envelope into the metal belly of the city. It made a sound, not quite a clunk, not quite a sigh, like it knew your words would go somewhere far, and maybe even come back. In Brighton Beach, babushkas sold piroshki from windowsills. Steam curled into the air. The dough was golden, the filling always a mystery. You'd hand over a nickel and walk away, chewing slowly, savoring each bite like a secret passed down through generations you'd never meet. You could still buy a toy from the 5 and dime and feel like you owned the world. A plastic glider, a slinky, a kazoo. No batteries, no charger, just imagination, and a quiet room by the radiator. And when it broke, you didn't cry. You just fixed it with tape and belief. In the laundromat, the machines hummed like lullabies. Mothers swapped gossip over folding tables. You learned to match socks before you could spell laundry. Someone always left a glove behind. Someone always forgot to add softener. But the place always smelled clean, like new starts. Kids sat on the stoop, reading comic books. Archie, Dick Tracy, Captain Marvel. The pages smelled like ink and summer. You'd trade issues, argue over heroes, and tape the torn covers back with whatever you could find. No one needed a phone. The story was always in your hands. Hardware stores were dark and full of wonder. Wooden floors creaked. Drawers held nails sorted by size. The man behind the counter wore an apron and knew where everything was. If you needed a bolt, he'd ask flathead or round, and you'd nod pretending you understood. That was part of growing up. Down by South Street, the fish market sang in the morning. Crates of mackerel eels twisting in metal bins, clams, cracking open on chipped marble counters. Men in rubber aprons shouted prices in thick accents, hands moving like music. The smell hit you, first salt sea and city sweat, and stayed long after you left. In a small brick church in Harlem choir practice was more than music. It was memory passed, mouth to mouth, breath to breath. Sopranos soared, tenors swayed, and kids sat in pews absorbing every note. The stained glass caught the late sun like holy fire, and for a moment the world felt like it was made of harmony. On hot afternoons, the Carvel, stand down the block, had a line stretching past the lamppost. You always ordered the same thing, soft-serve vanilla with rainbow sprinkles, and still stared at the menu like the answer to something bigger might appear. The ice cream melted faster than the small talk, and that was the best part. Brooklyn at night was neon poetry. Signs for delis, pawn shops, and corner cinemas flickered in half-light. The L train rattled overhead like a saxophone solo. You walked home under blinking reds and greens, the pavement shining like polished coal, and thought, this is what jazz must look like if it had corners. Inside the apartment, the fan in the window hummed while you did your homework at the kitchen table. The radio played Benny Goodman, or sometimes Perry Como. You chewed the end of your pencil and stared at the wallpaper. It was peeling, but it held. Like most things back then. Elevators in old tenement buildings had gates that folded like paper fans. You slid them open slowly, careful not to pinch your fingers, and pressed buttons that lit up like treasure maps. When the doors closed, the city fell away. For 5 floors you floated. The man who sharpened knives had a bicycle cart and a whistle you could hear from 3 streets over. He didn't knock. He just waited. You brought him scissors, dull steak knives, sometimes even lawn shears. He never spoke much, but when he left, things worked better. And that meant something. On Roosevelt Island, you could still find quiet. The skyline blinked across the river, but the air there felt softer, like someone had pressed pause. The grass was long, the benches lonely, and you'd sit there with a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, wondering what it all looked like 50 years before. There was always one neighbor with a parrot, usually in the window calling out greetings in a raspy voice. Hello, what's cookin'? Or a wolf whistle that made the mailman laugh. The bird outlived owners, outtalked children, and outwaited time. You grew up, left the block, and came back years later, and the bird was still there, same window, same hello. Old phone booths lined the avenues like tiny glass chapels. You stepped in, closed the door, and entered a world just big enough for your secrets. The dial clicked under your fingers. You'd drop in a dime and whisper into the receiver like the whole city wasn't listening through the walls. School plays were serious business. Cardboard sets, costumes sewn by hand, and spotlights that hummed like bees. You waited behind the curtain, heart-pounding script folded in sweaty palms. When your moment came, you stepped out into the light, not to be famous, just to be seen. And when the applause came soft, but sure, you felt taller. On cold mornings, you still caught the final streetcars, their wooden seats worn smooth by decades of daily life. They screeched around corners like stubborn ghosts, wires crackling above. One by one, they disappeared, replaced by buses. But for those who rode them, the clang of bell and rail never left the bones. Your first kiss might have happened under a fire escape, or on a rooftop, or maybe walking home with someone who shared their last piece of gum. It wasn't dramatic. No soundtrack, no crowd, just the city around you holding its breath, and the quiet realization that growing up wasn't somewhere far off anymore. Old women in shawls still fed pigeons in city parks with a kind of reverence. They mumbled to themselves in languages long faded from shop signs. The birds knew them, so did the benches. They weren't feeding birds. They were feeding memory quietly, daily, lovingly. The first television in the neighborhood turned a small living room into a public theater. Kids pressed faces to windows. Grown-ups pulled up chairs. The picture was grainy, the antenna never quite right. But when the Yankees played or Ed Sullivan came on, nobody minded the static. You leaned in heart wide open. You noticed one day that your street looked different. The grocer's sign was gone. The bakery had become something else. The man who used to sit on the stoop in suspenders and read the Post didn't sit there anymore. You didn't know where he'd gone, or when he'd stopped coming, but you knew something had shifted. Suddenly, new buildings rose. Old ones vanished like chalk and rain. The subway got louder. The nights felt shorter, and kids stopped playing stickball in the street. No one said goodbye. Cities don't do that. They just change. But you remembered. You remembered the smell of chestnuts roasting near Central Park, the sound of your father's shoes in the hallway, the weight of a library book in your backpack, the way your mother said your name when the streetlight flickered on. You remembered a time when things were slower, not easier, not simpler, but more felt. And though the city raced ahead, building up and out, and faster and brighter, you carried all of it with you folded inside like a ticket stub in a coat pocket. Long forgotten, but never really lost. Because New York in the 1950s didn't just live in photographs or newsreels. It lived in you. And maybe it still does.